source of inspiration from the Word of God. And I'm sorry, I know it's been a while. We were on vacation all last week, and we were in a place called Big Sky, Montana. Big Sky is known as being the largest or one of the largest ski resorts in all the United States. That's where my father-in-law lives. So we went up there to visit. I learned to snowboard. I had a great time. The only downside about Big Sky, Montana is there's like zero phone reception at the top of a mountain. Even the internet didn't work right most of the time. So, we weren't usually even at a place with any kind of reception at 5 o'clock. And the one day I did try to do an everyday hope sermon for you guys, I got such a bad signal that it kept cutting in and out throughout the entire thing. So we just had to wait, so I apologize. I know that we say we're going to do this every day, so I apologize for missing, and that's on me. But we're back, so don't worry. They'll be daily from this point on. And in the future, if there is going to be a break, next time to be better safe than sorry, I'll let you guys know ahead of time. But today I'm going to tell you a story. So those of you tuning in, stay tuned in. I'm going to give people a second to get joined because this is a really good story. This story has been really inspirational to me, and it really shows how God can work in people's lives, but how we have to leave the honor, the glory, and leave our works up to God that He puts on our hearts or that He gives us a mission for. Because I think a lot of times, even myself, I get caught up in the results, and that's not my place. If God puts something in my heart or asks me to do something, I need to do it to the best of my ability and leave the rest to Him. The results aren't what I was called to do. I was called to do something from God, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability and leave the rest to Him. So I think that this story does a really good job of talking about how we need to do what's God's placed in front of us and leave the results in His hands. To not get so caught up on how much of a difference we're making, or how popular of a speaker are we, or are we getting a large attendance in church. And I think that starts to get to a lot of people in the ministry and a lot of us who aren't in the ministry, just trying to make an impact among friends and family. So don't worry, you don't know the impact you may be having. So join in, it's a good story. I know the story pretty well, but not by heart, so I am going to have to read a lot of it. And I may not tell it as well as the original. I will post the original story in the feed as well for you guys so you can take a listen. But this is known as The Man on George Street. Great story. So, at a church in South London, as the service was closing, a stranger stood up in the back and asked the pastor if he could share his personal testimony. He said, pastor says, okay, go ahead. You have 3 minutes. And so he gets up there in the front of everybody, the congregation. He says, a few weeks ago, I was visiting a relative in Sydney, Australia, and there I was, walking down George Street, when I saw a little white-haired man stepping outside his doorway of a shop, and he said, excuse me, sir, are you saved? And if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? I was astounded at his words. Nobody had asked me such a thing and so directly. So all the way back to England on British Airways, I pondered his words. When I called a friend, I asked him about it. Thank goodness he was a Christian, and he led me to Christ. I want to fellowship here with you, and everyone clapped at his conversion, because Baptists love these stories. He heard about his conversion, and they clapped, and they thought, what a great story that had such an impact on him. And thank goodness his friend, was a Christian and led him to Christ. It all worked out. Now, that pastor of that church heard the story. He flew to Adelaide, Australia the next week to speak at a conference for a church. A woman asked to speak with him before he would hear her story. He wanted to know if she had given her heart to Christ. She said, I was visiting a friend in Sydney and doing some last-minute shopping on George Street. A little white-haired man stepped outside of his doorway and asked, excuse me, madame, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? I was greatly disturbed by these words. When I got back to Adelaide, I came to the church and sought out the pastor, and he led me to Christ. Twice in 2 weeks, he had heard about this man on George Street, this pastor. He then flew to Perth to speak in a church. After the service, a leading member of church took him out to eat, and he asked him how he came to Christ. two pastors out, hey, how'd you come to Christ? He said, I grew up in church and never really followed Christ. But because of my business ability and because of my standing with the church, I was given a place of influence with them. I was on a business outing in Sydney, walking down George Street, when a white-haired, little spiteful man came and stepped out and said, excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? I was infuriated and told him I was an elder of a church. I flew home and told my pastor what had happened, thinking he would sympathize with me about the rude little old man who came to me with this question. The pastor told me he had been disturbed for years about my spiritual condition and that he didn't think that I had ever given my heart fully to Christ. And he was right. I'd only gone through the motions. So my pastor led me to Jesus, and that day I was truly saved for the first time. The pastor flew home to London and was speaking in a ministers' conference in Keswick and shared the story of the little white-haired man from George Street that had saved and converted 3 people. 4 elderly pastors came up to him after the service and told him that they got saved between 25 and 30 years ago, respectfully. Through that little man on George Street, that they knew him and that they had the same experience. They stopped them and said, excuse me, have you been saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? He next was speaking at a convention in the Caribbean to a group of missionaries from his denomination and shared the story about the little white-haired man. 3 missionaries came up to him and said, we got saved through him 15 to 20 years ago, respectfully. The pastor continued on to Atlanta as these numbers had grown through this little man on George Street, and spoke to the Naval Chaplains Convention. After 3 days of speaking, the chaplain general took him out to a meal. He asked him how he gave his life to Christ, the general, that is. When I was a young sailor living a very sinful life, I was aboard a ship in the South Pacific. We stopped at Sydney Harbor for replenishments. I got blind drunk, got on the wrong bus, and was dropped off on George Street. A little white-haired man stepped out of the doorway. I thought he was a ghost, and he scared the living daylights out of me. Then he said, excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? The fear of God shook me, and I was shocked sober, and went back to the battleship, sought out the chaplain, and he led me to Christ. 6 months later, the pastor flew to India to do a convention for 5,000 Indian missionaries. The leader of the missionaries took him to his home to eat, and he asked, how did you, as a Hindu, come to Christ? The man replied, I was in a very privileged position. I worked for the Indian diplomatic mission, and I traveled the world. I am so thankful for Jesus and the forgiveness of sins, because I'd be very embarrassed if people knew how dark of a life I was living before. I was in Sydney, Australia, doing some last-minute shopping, getting some gifts for my wife and children. A little white-haired man stepped out and asked, excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? I was disturbed, and when I returned home, I sought out my Hindu priest. He told me to satisfy my curiosity to go talk to a Christian missionary and then return. That missionary led me to Christ. I abandoned Hinduism and soon began to study for ministry. I left the diplomatic mission and am today the head of these missionaries. We have led tens of thousands to Christ. 8 months later, he was speaking in Gamir, a southern suburb of Sydney, and he asked the pastor if he knew about a little man who would witness to people on George Street. He said he did. He said the man's name is Mr. Ginor, G-E-N-O-R. He doesn't do it anymore, though. He's too old and frail, he said. He was asked if he could meet him, and 2 nights later, they went to his apartment. And this frail little old man opened the door. He made them tea and was so frail, he kept spilling the tea into the saucer. The London preacher told him of all the accounts of the last few years, how he had heard his story once, told it again, and almost every time he would tell it, more people would come forward knowing this little man on George Street. He began to cry and said, my story goes like this. I was working on a warship, and at a time when my life fell apart, I went to a Christian man to whom I had treated horribly my whole life as his commanding officer. He led me to Christ, and my life changed from that day forward. I was so grateful to God that he had saved me that I told him I would share Jesus with at least 10 people every day. Now, some days I wasn't able to do it because I was sick or ill, but I made up for it other days. And I wasn't paranoid about it, but I wanted to do my best to fulfill the promise I'd made to God about witnessing to at least 10 people a day. I had done this for over 40 years, and in my retirement years, the best place was on George Street, as hundreds of people would go there and shop. I got a lot of rejections, but a lot of people listened to me. And in 40 years of doing it, I had never heard of one person coming to Christ because of my witness to them until this day. The pastor told him he had estimated and done the math that over 150,000 people had came through Christ or been influenced by his small witnessing to them. 2 weeks later, Mr. Ginner died. Now, even though he had no idea of the impact he was making, can you imagine his reward when he got to heaven? Nobody but a handful of people in Sydney knew Mr. Ginner, but I promise you, his name was famous in heaven. This was a man who just stayed dedicated and focused on the small mission God had given him, and that was to simply work to go outside and to tell at least 10 people about God in a very small, short statement as a witness. Excuse me, sir, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? That was it. And through that, over 140,000, just that we know of, were saved because of his small witness and his dedication to keeping his promise to God and keep doing what God placed before him, not being focused on the results. If you're in the story, he had no idea that even one person had come to Christ. How discouraged would you be after 40 years, after 10 years, if you had done that every day of your life, witnessed to 10 people, keep in mind all the rejection, all the hate you're going to get, and the few people who take your hand out and card that says that small bit of information as you say it to them, and they walk away. You've been doing this for years, and not once have you heard of one person coming to God. Would you not say, God, is this really what you want me to be doing? It doesn't seem like I'm making a difference. It doesn't seem like I'm making an impact for your kingdom. I've gotten caught up asking God these questions. But this man, for 40 years, kept doing what he promised God he would do. And until he was too old and too weak, he did it to the best of his ability. 2 weeks before his death, God rewarded him and brought a man to show him how many had been saved through his small testimony to them. That's amazing. If you can't listen to this story and see how God is still working today, still working in people's lives, and still putting on the hearts of us to be disciples and to go out and spread the gospel as we were called to in the book of Matthew, Mr. Ginner was truly a hero, and he truly, truly was famous in heaven. Can you just imagine 2 weeks after when he got to heaven and he heard the words from the Father, "Well done, my son." Man, that's just amazing. I was going to read a couple verses, but I just, it's such an impactful story. So I want us to focus on this, especially this week. Do what God places before you, do to the best of your ability, and witness to those people around you. The chances are God has you exactly where he wants you. You may say, I don't like this job, I don't like living here, I don't like this aspect of my friends, whatever it is. God has most of us exactly where he wants us. You could be these people's only testimony to God, your co-workers, your friends, and there'll be people that tell you shouldn't talk about God at work, and I will praise against that all day. Preach to those that you can. Testify to those that you can, all the people in your lives. Do what's placed in front of you. It doesn't have to be in a big way. It could be in a small way, but trust God with your heart. Spend time in prayer and do what he asks you to do. That's what we need to focus on this week. No matter how big or small, do what God asks you to do without focusing on the results. Well, you guys, as always, thank you for listening, and thank you for listening to my story about the little man on George Street. I'll post a link to the story below, as well as a video of the original pastor telling the story. That way you guys can listen to it for yourselves, or share it with anybody you like. Please like, comment, and share this video. Go to Today's Disciples on YouTube and subscribe. We need all the help we can get. And as always, never lose hope. You don't know what tomorrow may bring. I'll see you tomorrow, guys.